historic age debate. And just two ground rules. One is I love to give handouts. Now, unfortunately, obviously, I can't hand people anything right here because I'm not in the same city. But what I will do is I will send David a copy of this PowerPoint to share with the group. And then I'll also send this a short Word document that has links to what I've written on this topic. There's a series of, I think, at least 17 different 3-page articles in today's News Reason to Believe that covers a lot of this material in more detail and some other resources. So anyone interested in digging a little bit deeper, those would be some possibilities. And second thing is I love questions. Feel free to ask questions during the talk, but at the same time, there'll also be time at the end for people to ask questions. So if there's no questions at the moment, I will go ahead and dive in. Just to introduce myself, so as David mentioned, I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry. So that involves using computer programs to apply quantum mechanics to problems in chemistry. So I have a background in chemistry, background in physics, and also a lot of background in chemistry. But basically, I'm a glorified computer programmer. But I work for a company called Semichem. I'm currently a Reason to Believe trained apologist and a member of the scholar community. All right. To begin, let me introduce the modern age debate in contrast to the historic age debate that I'll be talking about. In the modern age debate, the issues that are most commonly talked about are, one is, what is the nature and length of the creation days? Are these 24-hour periods? Are they long periods of time, or are they something else? What is the age of the Earth? Is the Earth 6,000 years old, or is it billions of years old, or something else? What was the extent of Noah's flood? Was it a local flood, or did it cover the entire Earth? Did animals die before the fall? And what is the role of science in addressing these questions? So these are the age debate. The debate over these issues is the longest running debate in Christian history, covering basically the entire span of the church and even going back into earlier Jewish times. And so the perspective of this talk is to help address the debate that's going on today in our churches, is to look at the earliest days of the church and even earlier Jewish commentary in terms of how they dealt with it, to give our modern debate some perspective, looking at how these early figures understood, or perhaps more commonly misunderstood, the book of Genesis and how that affected how they interpreted things. So here's just kind of a quick list of interpretations of Genesis 1, in terms of the days of creation, trying to figure out what they mean. So obviously most people are familiar with the calendar day interpretation, that those days are simple calendar days or 24-hour periods. But others held that all of those events were instantaneous. They didn't take up any time. Another position was creation not in time, that time had a beginning somewhere on day 4, and hence we don't know what the time for the first 3 days are. The day age, of course, I think most people here would hold that the days of creation were long periods of time with a definite beginning, ending. There's the framework hypothesis that emphasizes the structure of Genesis rather than timing. The gap theory, or also known as ruin restoration, that Genesis 1:1 represents the original creation, what's found by scientists, but then that was ruined, and then the rest of Genesis 1 is a second creation, one only described in the Bible. And then historic creationism, that's John Sailhammer, where he's trying to apply, look at how earlier interpreters looked at it. And of course, there's dozens of other variants and interpretations. And so, again, we're trying to get some insights onto how do we interpret this issue as well as the other ones I've talked about, and what insights can we get by looking at how earlier theologians looked at it. Okay, so what can we learn from this talk? What do I hope that people will take away? One is, was there ever a consensus interpretation of Genesis? If the church has always interpreted one way and suddenly we're interpreting a different way, that could have some implications. But did the church ever have a consensus interpretation on the days of creation or the extent of Noah's flood? What extra biblical factors may have shaped how people interpreted the text? Were earlier generations in a better position to interpret Genesis? If they were, then we want to obviously listen to them. Now, in terms of the New Testament, obviously the early church fathers, one of the reasons we go to them is they were closer in language and culture to the writers of the New Testament. Therefore, they give us great insights. But does that apply to the Old Testament? Um, and lastly, when did interpretations like the day, age, and framework hypothesis first appear? Did they appear near the beginning, or they appear very late in history? Okay, so just a little bit about my methodology. Yeah, as I mentioned, my background is theoretical chemistry, and I'm sure that made people scratching their heads. Why am I talking about church history? I mean, that is so completely outside my field of discipline, and it's true. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a church historian, and everything I've learned has been through massive amounts of study. And this uh, comes from research that spans many, many years, and reading a lot of stuff. So, for example, I read, almost all the original Jewish and Christian writings up until about 500 AD. Trying to be as exhaustive as possible. For later time periods, I had to rely on studies coming from individuals because there's no way I could read everything, but intentionally choosing individuals from all sides of the debate. So I'm not just reading from older creationists, but also young creationists and other positions. And then also another perspective is to look at creeds, confessions of faith, and other doctrinal statements. Rather than just looking at how individuals interpreted it, how does the church, where does the church draw the line on what was important? Which we find, which is what they put out in these important doctrinal statements, and also include studying a lot of biographical information about some of the church fathers, looking at historical context. So not just what they said, but why they said it, trying to understand that, and also help needed to divide history into different time periods, because it's interesting because certain time periods most people kind of held a very similar view, and then but those but you have distinct time periods where you have different issues and perspectives, and so this is one of my bookshelves just to give you a hint of how much I read in doing all the research that went into this. So there's 28 volumes of the early church fathers plus a bunch of other books. But anyways, my study details more than 70 Christian theologians and 2 Jewish scholars, includes the Apocrypha and at least 15 early Jewish writings, and 20 creeds and doctrinal statements. So, bringing a wide variety of different perspectives, just to look at the diversity of how people understood some of these issues. So, I had to define time periods. These are somewhat standard, but kind of partially my own. So looking at pre-Christian Judaism up to 90 AD, early Judaism from 90 AD to 476 AD, the Apostolic Church period would be 30 AD to 90 AD. That's when the apostles were still alive. The early church period up to 476 AD, and then early and late Middle Ages, early and late Reformation, and the Golden Age of Science. And again, each of these time periods had their own strengths and weaknesses, and they focus on slightly different things. And it's interesting to kind of see those contrasts. All right, so now what about existing studies? I mean, it'd be so nice if someone has already written all this and I could just hand people the book and say, hey, someone's already done this, I don't need to research it. But the problem is, this is an area that really needs a lot of work. And unfortunately, studies from an older perspective, there's not really a whole lot of them. And most of them, unfortunately, are very poor quality. So, for example, some of the things I found was frequently misunderstood or misrepresented the positions of the early church. For example, William T. Shedd was wrongly claimed that some of the early church fathers taught a day-age view. Henry Blocker wrote that Augustine held something similar to a framework hypothesis view. Arthur C. Constance suggested Constant held a gap theory. None of those three cases are correct. So, unfortunately, older creationists don't tend to put a lot of emphasis on the subject, rather instead focusing on the scripture itself. The one kind of big exception to that rule is Stanley Yaki, who's a Catholic priest, I believe, but also a scientist. His book Genesis 1 through the Ages Really good book. Unfortunately, it just doesn't quite go into quite the depth I needed to answer my questions. So otherwise, it's a really excellent resource. Now, what about young Earth creationists and how they've written on this topic? Well, it turns out they've written a whole lot on this topic, but unfortunately, the reason I can't look to that too much is that they tend to miss a lot of extra biblical factors shaping the interpretation, things that don't fit into what they want to find. They're often very selective in their analysis, picking up details that support what their desired conclusion while tending to ignore others. And they often subtly project our modern age debate back onto earlier theologians, which is, of course, violates the whole point of the study. The one interesting positive example is Robert Bradshaw, his website, Creationism and the Early Church. And I mention this because this, even though he comes from a youngest perspective, is actually somewhat critical of Hugh Ross and other old Earth creationists. He gave a really insightful, gives a lot of insights into this perspective. So just kind of give my own journey in this, I had spent a lot of time, from my days in undergraduate to the time I started in this topic, looking at how to properly interpret Genesis 1, and Hugh Ross's book were very critical in that. And I really felt comfortable with how to understand the text itself. But then I read a book, Three Views on Creation. I forget the exact title of it, but Genesis 1 was presented by three different sets of authors, one from a young Earth perspective, one from old Earth, including Hugh Ross, and one from a framework hypothesis. But when they talked about what the early church said about this topic, they gave completely different results. And that was what intrigued me. Why can't we get a clear answer in terms of what they believed? And so my initial stage was just, compare and contrast. So take, young Earth, old Earth, and other sources and try to see where they agreed, in which case they're, probably right, and where they disagreed, try to sift through things. And that's when I came across Robert Bradshaw's work. And it really gave me a new insight because not only did he talk about what they taught, but why they taught it, some of the underlying factors shaping interpretation, which I'll talk more about later. And then from there, eventually, he was integrated more sources until I finally decided I need to actually read the early church fathers for myself rather than simply relying on other people's interpretations. And so was really the genesis of my journey into the topic of the historic age debate. And again, it spanned over many, many years. And what you're going to hear today is the byproduct, the fruit of all that research. Okay, so to sum up, this huge amount of data that I collected, I've summarized it into 7 lessons, which is what I'm presenting here. Okay, lesson number 1 is that the early church fathers and others were heavily dependent on translations. They were not, in general, reading the actual Hebrew. And I think people may be surprised by that. So the vast majority of the early interpreters, including also, that's true mostly of many modern interpreters, is they're relying on translations, Greek and Latin in the early church, and today we primarily, base it on English or other European languages. In the early church, only 2 figures, Jerome and Theodore of Mopsuestia, were fluent in Hebrew, and Origen may have had some knowledge of Hebrew, but for the most part, the rest did not know any Hebrew. Similarly, the early church fathers lacked a knowledge of Jewish culture and had little access to Jewish commentaries on Genesis. So they were not, they're kind of since reinventing the wheel, starting from scratch, but from a Gentile Christian perspective with little input from the earlier Jewish commentaries. And then later in the Middle Ages, they were primarily dependent on the Latin Vulgate. So now they're not reading in Hebrew, they're now reading in Latin. So here's 4 specific translations, 4 of the most influential translations in history. One is the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation. So the pre-Christian Jews and it's also very important in the early church period. Um, and you have what's called the Old Latin Bible, which is a series, not a single translation, but a series of translations of the New Testament into Latin. But at the same time, it was a translation of the Septuagint into Latin. So for the Old Testament, this is in a sense a double translation. So the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into the Greek Septuagint, which is then translated into Latin. So 2 steps away from the original Hebrew. In the Middle Ages, the Latin Vulgate was dominated for more than 1,000 years, and then the King James English translation was absolutely critical. Played a huge role from the Reformation to modern times. And what's important is that these translations were frequently treated as having the same or greater authority than the original Hebrew. That the translation itself became more important than the original document. And that's unfortunate because, as these are good translations, they did have individual flaws, which I will point out. And this dependent on translation had a lot of subtle influences throughout history. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the statue of Moses by Michelangelo. Can anyone tell me what's wrong here? What's unusual? So, anyways, I guess no one's guessing, but
Got 2
Yeah, he
horns.
has horns.
he's got horns. Yeah, and so most people are like, what? Where did that come from? Well, it turns out that is based on the Latin Vulgate, which had a mistranslation from the Hebrew. So, after Moses had been with God, there was light coming off his face, and that Hebrew got got translated into horns. So it said he had horns. And so that was incorporated into sculptures. Um, we're kind of, laugh at it today, but, people took that translation very literally because they were not looking at the original Hebrew. So I'll just give a few more examples. So I already mentioned the horns of Moses in the Vulgate, but in Exodus 121 in the Septuagint, talks about, if you remember, the Pharaoh was getting concerned about the number of Israelites, and so he gave a command to the midwives to get rid of all the male children. They disobeyed, and then God gave them a reward. And the Septuagint reads that they made houses for themselves. And you're probably puzzled. That's not what our English translations say today, and it just doesn't make sense. But again, that was a mistranslation. So when we talk about houses here, of course, we think of a building that you live in, but that's not what it was the original Hebrew was talking about. When we talk about like the house of David, that's not the building he lived in, but his family, his dynasty. So made houses in Hebrew really meant that they had children, that they established families, which in that makes perfect sense. Building houses did not. So that caused a stumbling block for some people. Perhaps the most significant example of a translation-related problem was the Old Latin Bible for Romans 5:12 in the topic of original sin. Now, Augustine, the great church theologian of the early church in the 5th century, he didn't know any Hebrew, only knows some Greek, so he's primarily relying on Latin. And in the Latin of Romans 5:12 said that we inherit the Adam's sin itself, whereas the Greek, the church fathers relying on Greek, said we only inherit the consequences of Adam's sin, not the sin itself. So this was a huge issue, of original sin. Do we inherit, the consequence of Adam's sin, or do we inherit in itself, Adam's sin itself? And so, but that issue came from a mistranslation. And then, for the King James, one simple example is the translation of the 6th commandment is "Thou shalt not kill." The underlying Hebrew is really "Thou shalt not murder," which is a little bit different. But some people have seized on this translation to say, "Oh, the Bible's against capital punishment because we're not supposed to kill people." So again, these are just 4 simple examples. There's obviously others, where translation, even though it's a good translation in general, sometimes they had some problems, and those problems could sometimes have long-reaching consequences. Okay, so in addition to the translation itself, there's what's called, I call the linguistic effect in translation. And here I'm relying on Rodney Whitefield's Reading Genesis 1. And so, hey, Rodney, and it's glad you're listening in. Keep me accountable if I say anything wrong. But anyways, one of a big point in this book is that Hebrew has an extremely small vocabulary. The entire Old Testament consists of 8,674 Hebrew words, or if you're just looking at root words, it's something like 2,552 words for the entire Old Testament. That's not a lot of words. Modern English contains over 1 million words, not including technical and biochemical words. And so because of this, Hebrew words often have multiple meanings, compared to English. English words are much more precise. Hebrew is also very verb rich and noun poor. So in Hebrew, you focus on the verbs, as an English reader, we tend to focus more on the nouns. And so that affects how we interpret the text. Lastly, Hebrew verbs do not have tense. English verbs do. So in Hebrew, actions are either complete or incomplete, and therefore Hebrew verbs can correspond to multiple English tenses. And so, trying to understand the time sequence, we have to be very careful not to read in the narrowness, the narrowness coming from our English translations. And so another issue for translation is what I call the cultural influence of translation. And in C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, I think he really does a great job of expressing this whole point. And I love this quote. So basically, he began to study the great works of literature in their original language, learning French and so forth, and Greek and Latin. And so as he's learning Greek, he makes a statement. I was beginning to think in Greek. This is the great Rubicon to cross in learning language. Those in whom Greek words live only while they are hunting for it in the lexicon, and who then substitute the English word for it, are not reading Greek at all. They're only solving a puzzle. The very formula that nos equals a ship is wrong. Nos and ship both mean a thing, they do not mean one another. Behind nos, as behind navis and naka, we want to have a picture of a dark, slender mast with sail or oars climbing the ridges. No officious English word intruding. So, in Greek, nos means ship, but it means a very specific type of ship, the type of ship that they would have at their time, as opposed to an English ship. So I help put that in contrast. So, nos equals the ship on the left, while our English word could refer to the ship on the right. And we tend to incorporate our own cultural perspectives when we read the text, and that's the danger that I'm trying to get at here. Some examples of this cultural influence. When we read the genealogies in ancient Hebrew, particularly those in Genesis 5 and 11, which are used to try to date back to Adam. In ancient Hebrew, they were concerned primarily with just ancestry. Jesus is the son of David. It doesn't matter how many generations he's removed, it's the fact that he is descended from David that matters. Whereas in English, is primarily concerned with absolute biological relationships. For example, father, son, ben, begat, yalad. In the Hebrew, all those allow for gaps. But again, in English, we tend to assume there cannot be any gaps. In similar terms, geographical terms, for example, earth, aretz, means land, soil, country. It's very local, but when we hear the word earth, most of us immediately think of the globe, of the entire planet Earth. which would be, global. And so we tend to read those terms being much broader in geography than are actually intended in the text. So there's just a few examples. I mean, there are many, many other examples. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few specific translations that have a specific effect in the early chapters of Genesis. One is in when you read Genesis 6:1-4, so that's setting up for Noah's flood. It talks about this, people intermarrying with the sons of God, and then also talks about the Nephilim. And so in the early church and early Jewish commentary, there's two different interpretations, for the sons of God. One is that they're angels, and the other is that they're the Sethites. The Sethites ultimately intermarried with their neighbors and corrupted themselves. But in the Septuagint, it actually changes the text and replaces sons of God with angels. So they were forcing that particular interpretation. And they also replaced the word Nephilim with giants, which again is not in the actual Hebrew. And so this translation actually altered how people understood that particular passage. And so the Hebrew rabbis following Hebrew often went to the Sethite interpretation, whereas Rose's fathers following the Greek tended to follow more of the angel's interpretation. But the other things, the age of fatherhood in Genesis 5:11, the ages needed to compute, the time between Adam and Abraham, the Septuagint actually gives a different set of values compared to Hebrew. And the Samaritan Pentateuch actually gives a third set of values. So apparently, when the Septuagint was being translated, it was trying to make progressive ages smoother by adding 100 years here and 100 years there. And so if you actually try to make age estimates based on their genealogy, you get different answers depending on whether you're using the Hebrew or the Septuagint. Now I'm going to come back, this is a big issue, I'm going to come back to that more later. Again, this is a huge effect coming from a translation. Things like translational inertia, the firmament in Genesis 1:6-8 in the King James, that's just a carryover from the Latin translation from the Vulgate. So sometimes people, again, rather than going back to the original, subtly ideas can just pass forward. And then this evening, morning, day phrase of Genesis 1, the King James in particular dramatically oversimplifies it. I'm going to go through that in some detail here. So let's look at Genesis 1:5, and I'll be using Rodney Whitefield's direct translation. So he has it read, and there was evening, and there was morning one time. Now let's look at the King James, and there was evening, and the morning were the first day. The NASB, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. And NIV, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Now let's kind of just pick it apart. What are some differences between Whitefield's translation and the King James here? So first of all, Whitefield uses time instead of day. That Hebrew word yom is not necessarily a calendar day, that's more broader. But setting that point aside for the moment, there's some other critical differences. One is in the Hebrew, there are three clauses here, and there was evenings, clause 1, and there was morning, clause 2, one time, third clause. And notice in the King James how it transforms that into a single sentence. And there was evening and morning were the first day. And that means evening and morning are directly modifying day, which a lot of young earth creationists used to argue that day must be a 24-hour calendar day because they're modified by evening and morning. But that's actually not quite the way it happens in Hebrew. Even more importantly is the King James leaves out the second verb. In the direct translation, it appears twice. There was evening, there was morning, but in the King James, it only appears once. Evening and morning were. And so those are just one other example is, it says one time, Yom Echad, or Yom Echad which is, day one or one day. But the King James transforms it from the cardinal one to the ordinal first. So again, that's a change from the actual original reading. And so the NIV does a little bit better. It does keep it into 3 clauses, but even it makes some change to the text. For example, using first instead of one. And so, in each of the cases for the King James, when it's oversimplifying things, it's oversimplifying things in a way that tends to emphasize a calendar day interpretation, things that are not in the original text. So that's part of why in English there's such a strong young earth movement, is because a lot of them are relying on the King James translation. Now, looking at the evening, morning, day, that X day, again, note some key differences. So you have in Rodney Whitefield's Hebrew translation, one time, a second time, a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, the sixth time, the seventh time. Now let's look at the King James and NIV. The first day, the second day, the third day. Now notice some interesting things. Like on the first day, it's one day or day one, and in the King James and NIV is the first day. Again, going from one to first to make things more orderly, but that's not in the Hebrew. But the bigger thing is the inclusion of the definite article. So in the Hebrew, it's one time, no definite article, a second, third, again, no definite article. Whereas in the NIV and King James, it's the first day, the second day. And this is hugely important because, with that definite article is saying it's a specific day, whereas in Hebrew, it's indefinite. It's leaving the meaning of day much more open. And so that, again, has a huge effect on our interpretation. Now, when we come down to the 6th and 7th day, you notice it's the 6th day and the 6th time and the 7th time. Now, that seems to maybe give some support to young earth, but there's actually a subtlety in the Hebrew here. Now, in English, the definite article can only appear once. It's either the 6th day or 6th day. But in Hebrew, you can have the definite article appear twice, one for applying to day and one applying to the ordinal. So, for example, the Hebrew reads Yom the 6th. So the 6th is definite, but day is left indefinite. So it'd be different if it read the Yom the 6th, which would make day definite. So in other words, the emphasis here is on the 6th and 7th, not on day. So it's the 6th day, emphasis on the 6th, not the 6th day, emphasis on day. And again, that has a huge effect on our interpretation. If you look at the Hebrew perspective, they're emphasizing the Sabbath pattern, the 6th and 7th. The Sabbath pattern is to rest on the 7th, whereas in English, we're coming and focusing on the wrong thing. We're focusing on the day, the time period, but that's not what the actual text says. And this is a huge point, but is often completely missed by English readers. Okay, so conclusion from lesson one. One is most confusion over Genesis 1 to 11 throughout history has been the result of relying on translation rather than the original Hebrew. The poor King James rendering of Genesis 1 was a major factor in driving a calendar day interpretation among English speakers. And lastly, I think it's fair to say that modern scholars have an edge over the early church with respect to understanding Hebrew. Now, in terms of the Greek New Testament, we often look back to the church fathers for good reason. They were closer in language and culture, but that does not true for the Old Testament. They did not have the knowledge of Hebrew that many scholars have today. Okay, so lesson number 2, creation ex nihilo, or nihilo. So creation ex nihilo literally means creation out of nothing. It's a belief that God brought everything into existence by his own power. So he not only brought planets and worlds into existence and people, but he brought even matter itself into existence. In everything that we see, space and time, God brought into existence. And this is of great theological importance, both to early Jewish and Christian thinkers, as well as for us today. Ones that rejected the Greek notion of eternal matter. Now, in the Greek model, the gods existed within space and time. Matter always existed. The gods didn't. They came into existence sometime after the existence of matter. And the gods only formed matter into the things we see, the people, places, or they had the demiurge, that the maker, do that. But the gods did not create the matter, they simply inherited it. And then also the Gnostics, which was kind of a group of heretical beliefs that sprang up within the church, tried to bring in Greek ideas into Christian theology. Many of them taught that matter was evil. Spirit's good, matter's evil. And so, creation ex nihilo rejects that, saying God created this matter. Matter itself is not evil. And so also another interesting subtlety is that beginning to the universe implies an end to the universe. A beginning of matter implies an end to matter. So the Greeks believe matter is eternal, so there'd be no beginning and no ending. But Christians said there's a beginning, therefore there must also be an ending. And also a beginning certainly implies a beginning of time, that time itself, not just matter, but time had a beginning. And Augustine in the 5th century is the one that really gave the most modern view, that God created time. And that's something that we only have proven scientifically in the last century. But that was radically ahead of anyone at that time. All right. So in terms of creation, contrasting the Christian and Jewish and Christian worldview compared to other worldviews. So creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, obviously, is monotheistic. But then you have, in contrast, creation ex materia, creation out of pre-existing matter. So this was what was held by the Greeks and Romans of the early church period. So it's most polytheist, but also atheist today. It's a very Western view. But we would object to that because it elevates matter to the level of God. If matter is eternal, that makes it co-equal with God. That would be ditheism, and hence, as monotheists, we have to reject that. So we believe that there's a time that God existed and matter did not, and then God ultimately brought matter into existence. But the third alternative is creation ex deo, creation out of God. That would be pantheistic in this very Eastern perspective, that everything we see, people, mountains, computers, all that's all aspects of God. There is no matter. What we think is matter is just an illusion. It's all God. And so as Christians, we would object to that because it violates the creator-creation distinction. So we believe there's God on one side and matter on the other, and that God could destroy matter, destroy the entire universe, and he would not be diminished because it is separate from him. So you can begin to see why this notion of creation ex nihilo was such an important doctrine, both in the early church and the day. So this near universal affirmation of creation ex nihilo is recognized by early Jewish writers as early as the 2nd century BC, so 200 years before Christ. It was consistently taught by the church fathers. It was included in the rule of faith. So it's basically a summary of essential beliefs, more of a verbal statement. But this was considered an essential under the early church. By the early church fathers. It's included in major creeds and confessions of faith. In fact, and wonderfully, modern science confirms a beginning of the universe. And I think Reason to Believe has done a great job of really highlighting this essential point. So lesson number 2, creation ex nihilo was considered an issue of Christian orthodoxy. Of all issues of creation, only this one was considered an issue of orthodoxy, where the church drew a line in the sand saying, you have to stand on this side. other issues like the age of the earth, that was just an issue of interpretation. It was never an issue of orthodoxy. Only creation ex nihilo within the issues related to creation was ever considered an issue of orthodoxy. In fact, it was treated on the same level theologically as the Trinity, the virgin birth, and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was that important, and for good reason. So beginning to matter was an essential issue related to creation, not the age of the universe. All right. So let's look at some exegetical issues. Um, one is non-Calendar day interpretations, particularly instantaneous creation and creation not in time, have a long history, almost long as Calendar day. So Calendar day interpretation appears roughly in the 2nd century BC, and instantaneous creation appears in the 1st century BC, so almost at the same time. So what reasons were given for rejecting a Calendar day view? So let's look at some of that. And important to note, a day's view was not clearly stated until way late in history, the 17th century. I know Hugh Ross and others have suggested some of the church fathers actually held a day's view, but that's almost certainly not correct. But there's a reason for that, which I'll get into later. Okay, so what are some specific figures rejecting a Calendar interpretation? So in Judaism, Philo, very important philosopher in the early church, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Hilary of Poitiers, and Augustine. In Middle Ages, John Scotus of Ragusa, possibly Anselm, he's a little bit unclear, and Peter Lombard. In Reformation, John Colet and Thomas Brown. So it's important to note that there is a continual strain of non-Calendar interpretations of people saying, I think there's something wrong with Calendar, I'll take something else. So the question is, why did some people not accept the Calendar interpretation? I think it's a very important question to ask. And there's at least 3 exegetical issues that tended to lead people in that direction. One is the 4th day of creation. In the early church, they often misunderstood Genesis as saying the sun, moon, and stars were actually created on the 4th day. I think our interpretation today would say that's not true. Sun, moon, and stars were created in the beginning and only became visible on the 4th day. So we would say something different, but this issue of the sun, moon, and stars being created on the 4th day, that was, after the days of creation, that was the most debated issue relating to the early church of Genesis in terms of commentary, in terms of what influence they thought it might have on the interpretation. So what was the nature of light on the first 3 creation days? So if the sun, moon, and stars did not appear the 4th day, then how do we understand the first 3 days? That was the big issue. That, how can they be simple solar days if the sun did not exist for those first 3 days? That was why that was such a big issue then. Second was the 7th creation day. If you note, it's never closed out. The first 6 days are closed out. The 7th day is not. So we can say that it's actually ongoing. We're still in the 7th day. Some would say it's ongoing, but will come to an end. Others say the 7th day is eternal. It's always going to go on. But if the 7th day is ongoing, then it can't be a simple 24-hour period. And then in Genesis 2:4 talks about in the day God created. So the word day here is being applied to the entire account of Genesis 1. So day there cannot be a 24-hour period and have the 6 days also be 24-hour periods. That would be inconsistent. And so that created some confusion. So what is the meaning of day here in contrast to the ones in Genesis 1? Okay, so just in conclusion for lesson 3, the Calendar day interpretation was never the consensus view at any point in church history. It's been very strong at times, particularly during the Reformation period, but it was never the sole interpretation. It was never the consensus of the church. Appearance of non-Calendar day interpretations resulted from specific exegetical issues, therefore cannot be dismissed lightly. So in other words, today, non-Chaldean interpretations are often dismissed as a compromise to science, but here you have people where science was not the issue. It was their understanding, sometimes not always necessarily correct, their understanding of the text itself that were leading them to not accept the Chaldean interpretation. All right, so hermeneutics is our lesson 4. And so question is, should we divide the early church fathers into two camps, one being the literalists, those holding a Chaldean view, and the others being allegorists, those rejecting a Chaldean view? This is essentially the thesis of, for example, James Mook in chapter 1 of the book Coming to Grips with Genesis 1. And so if that's his thesis, if that's true, if the Chaldean views, early church fathers holding Chaldean view are the literalists, then surely we should follow them. If anyone rejecting Chaldean view are allegorists, they're basing it on a bad interpretation, we should obviously dismiss them. And that would be a powerful argument to dismiss my previous point, my previous lesson, and support a Chaldean view. But is that a fair way of looking at the early church fathers? Okay, so just the important thing is to understand some of the context of how these people are interpreting the text. Because again, we live in a very different context today, and we need to understand what was influencing how they thought. So for example, in early Judaism, they were subjected to something called Hellenism. So Alexander the Great in the 4th century ultimately brought Israel under Greek control, and the Greeks had a policy of Hellenization, of promoting Greek philosophy and language. And so by the 2nd century BC, most Jews outside of Israel did not know Hebrew. They were primarily reading the Greek Septuagint. In fact, that's part of the reason why they created the Septuagint translation in the first place, is to make the Old Testament accessible to those who only knew Greek. So you have the issue of language, but also Greek philosophy and science posed a direct challenge to Hebrew beliefs. And so the debate over Genesis, how old is the earth, and those issues really started in the 2nd century BC in response to these challenges. So it's important to understand that for the first 1,300 years, we were primarily dealing with Hebrew, possibly Aramaic. There was no issue over the age of the earth. That was simply a non-issue. It only becomes an issue with the presence of Greek language, but also the challenge of Greek culture and philosophy as they're trying to respond. And so, it's important to understand it did not come from a simple reading of the scripture, but it came from a sense of apologetics of trying to deal with this new context. And it's important to understand that that Jesus and the apostles were, of course, Jewish, as were the New Testament writers, except for Luke. And so the church during the apostolic period operated within a synagogue, where essentially Christianity was treated as a sect of Judaism. But that changed. Between 70 AD and 150 AD, the church shifted from primarily Jewish to primarily Gentile. So by 150 AD, all the early church fathers were Gentile, as were almost all of the people they were teaching. So from the early church onward, Genesis 1 to 11 was interpreted through a non-Jewish, non-Hebrew lens. So what are some of the implications of the early church understanding of the Old Testament? One is the early church fathers and their audience had little interest in Jewish history. After all, they're not Jewish. Most of them did not know Hebrew, and there are a couple exceptions. They lacked familiarity with Jewish Old Testament commentaries. Although they were not, using this existing knowledge, they were starting from scratch and starting from a Greco-Roman perspective. And also, there's the importance of Greek philosophy. So some of the early fathers still embraced certain Greek ideas, while other times they were rejecting Greek ideas, and that tension affected sometimes how they interpreted the text. So summing this all together, they need to make the Old Testament relevant to a Greco-Roman audience. And so that's part of what gave rise to allegorical interpretation. This started among the Hellenized Jews of the 2nd century in Alexandria, Egypt. It's carried over in the early church. Some proponents are Philo, a Jewish writer, but also Clement of Alexandria, Origen, um, and much later, the allegorical interpretation was really taken up by the Catholic Church, and the Protestants really rebelled against that. That was a major factor in the Reformation. Is like we need to go back to Scripture and not allegorize things. Okay, so to help understand what do we mean by allegorical interpretation, one major example comes from Origen, great Christian scholar of the 3rd century. He had what's called the threefold method of interpretation. One is the body meaning, which would be just simply the plain, literal, obvious meaning. So and so did such and such. Then the soul level of interpretation would be moral principles. What can I apply, from that event to my life today? And the spirit would be deeper meaning, obviously, usually using allegory to help come up with a meaning, one that would be relevant to their current audience. So this often used. One was when the literal meaning seemed absurd. So, for example, I mentioned Exodus 121, where it talks about as a reward to the Hebrew midwives for not aborting the Jewish babies, that they made houses for themselves. So Origen suggested, because that literal, that mistranslation didn't make sense, he suggested that they were this was prefiguring the building of churches, which kind of makes sense. But again, trying to help the Old Testament make sense when they sometimes misunderstood it, but also allowed for discussion of contemporary issues. Like, for example, one example is in Genesis 3:24, it talks about the cherubim guarding Eden, preventing Adam and Eve from coming back, and it goes to two different directions. And so one author suggested that represents the spheres of heaven, which, I mean, for us today is that kind of like where they get that. But again, allegorizing it allows them to bring in issues like the spheres of heaven, which is not directly addressed anywhere in Scripture. So allegorizing did play a role in the early church at times. Two other tools that were sometimes used are typology and numerology. The early church viewed the Old Testament as primary Christological. So everything in the Old Testament is somehow a revelation of Christ. And so the question is, how do you bring that out, even if it seems to be talking about something entirely differently? So the church fathers often use allegory, typology, or numerology to bring out these connections. For example, any references to wood, for example, the tree of life, the oak of memory, the staff of Moses and Aaron, were seen as prefiguring the cross. So again, that's allegory. So you have wood, which has a literal historical meaning, and then allegory suggests that it's connected to Christ. Waters is prefiguring baptism. So this tend to minimize the literal history of the events. Again, the reason is, for a Gentile audience, Jewish history didn't mean a lot to them. So, this allegory was, and other methods trying to make it relevant to them. So the early church fathers had a high view of Scripture, but unfortunately, it sometimes led to some very strange interpretations. One of the more extreme examples is from the Epistle of Barnabas. So this was something written in the 2nd century by an Alexandrian Jew named Barnabas, but was sometimes believed to have been written by the actual biblical Barnabas, and hence it was came close to being included in the canon, but it was ultimately rejected. But it talks about, in Genesis 14:14, it talks about the 300 servants of Abraham. Now, if we read that, we just say, okay, Abraham has 318 servants. End of story. That's the simple, plain meaning. But this Epistle of Barnabas went a bit farther in saying, well, maybe if we take 318 and interpret it as 10, 8, and 300, and 10 is written as an I, and 8 is an H, these are the initials of Jesus Christ, and the 300 is denoted by a T, which looks like the shape of a cross. So therefore, the 318 servants represents the cross of Christ. So again, this is kind of seems very bizarre to us today, but it was a way of trying to connect the Old Testament to the New Testament. Okay, so now we're the literalists, um, you know, sometimes the so-called literalists, those holding to calendar interpretation, weren't always very literal, as often assumed. For example, Victorinus talks about days as having 24-hour periods, as being 24 hours. And so this is a passage that's strongly used by young earth creationists to say, hey, he says day equals 24 hours. But if you look at the passage, his focus was on numerical association, just different examples of the use of the number 24. For example, the 24 elders mentioned in the book of Revelations and many other examples. So it really was not a clear passage about trying to define a day as 24-hour periods. Another example comes from Hippolytus, another shining figure for young earth creationism. He claimed that Jesus came in the year 5,500. And so some passages he used to try to support that. One is Revelation 17:10, which says, 5 kings have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come. And if you interpret the kings as being millennia and not yet come as half a millennia, then that would be 5,500 years. Or the Ark's Covenant dimension summing to 5.5 cubits. If you take cubit to be a millennia, then that means Jesus would become in 5.5 millennia. And so the Ark of the Covenant was interpreted Christologically as referring to Christ. And again, John 19:14, now it's 6 hours, that's a half a day or 500 years. So again, these are examples of non-literal arguments used by the so-called literalists, as the young earth creationists would call them. What about Greek science and philosophy? The early church fathers often used Greek science of their day. For example, some of them talked about spontaneous generation, seminal principles. That means that things start as seeds and grow up, and also the earth is round. So contrary to some more modern myths, the church has always understood the earth to be round, following Greek thinking. So they always tried to keep the best parts of Greek science. At the same time, there are certain parts they had to reject. For example, they rejected the Greek notion of eternal matter, which contradicted the biblical notion of creation ex nihilo. So they tried to accept good parts of Greek science while rejecting certain other parts. Okay, so in conclusion, both the literalists and the allegorists had valid points in terms of arguing calendar versus not calendar, but they also had weaknesses. They were deeply influenced by Greek language and thought. They were often writing to make the Old Testament meaningful to a Gentile audience rather than being strictly literal. Therefore, they're also reacting for and against Greek science of the day. And so, when young earth creationists try to use some of these figures to support their modern calendar interpretation, I think that's really a weak argument, that they're not really as strong as, that they don't make it a strong case as often presumed. What about the development of biblical chronologies, actually attempting to date backwards to Adam to give a date for the age of the earth? So when were the first chronologies dating back to creation developed? What were the driving forces behind this? What impact did this have on how people understood the age of the earth? Okay, so some specific examples. So the Book of Jubilees is probably the earliest. In the late 2nd century BC, Josephus, in his work Antiquity of the Jews, he gives a chronology. Theophilus, Julius Africanus, and the Jewish calendar in the 4th century. At least 20 different early Jewish and Christian sources at least reported some age estimate for the earth, and a few of those 5 actually recognize some uncertainties. That they recognized that different people were giving different ages. But yeah, so this has a long tradition, but it only goes back to maybe the 2nd century BC. Okay, so what was the reason behind developing this chronology in the first place? How is it important to early Jews and Christians? So one was, it was a reaction against the ages taught by other religions. So for example, each religion had its own ideas on how old the earth was. So the Egyptians had one age and so forth. And so this would allow Jews and Christians to have their own distinct perspective and distinguish themselves from everyone else. But perhaps more importantly, a finite age helped argue for creation ex nihilo. That there was a beginning to the universe and everything. And so having that, seeing that as something relatively near in time helps drive that argument. Not necessarily the argument, but that was helpful to be able to give a distinct age to say, hey, we know when it began. Now, obviously, I don't think we're persuaded by that, but still, that was part of their thinking. The next few arguments are ones used in early church and early Jewish figures, but you would not hear today. One is it established the antiquity of Moses and the prophets. Now, what does that mean, and how did that help them? So at that time, the notion was that the earlier source wrote, an earlier source is usually more authoritative than a newer source. We tend to have the opposite view today. We tend to prefer newer sources, but in that day, the older the better. That would be the more original, more authoritative. And so what they're trying to say is by developing chronology going back at least as far as Moses, they could say that Moses wrote before the Greek philosophers. So most of the big major Greek philosophers started in the 5th century BC, but Moses, for example, is written as far back as 1500 BC. So he wrote well before the Greek philosophers, as well as did all the other prophets and Old Testament writers. And that would make them authoritative. Therefore, being able to establish when Moses and the other prophets wrote would help establish the authority of Scripture over Greek philosophy. But it also led to a second argument, what's called the theft of the Greeks argument, that not only did the Old Testament writers write before the Greeks, but that the Greeks actually stole or plagiarized ideas from Scripture. So they would say, oh, and Plato got this idea from Moses, for example. And this was of apologetic significance because they could then say that we can accept some aspect of Greek philosophy, even though it's a pagan origin, because they stole some of it from Scripture. So we can pick out certain aspects of Greek philosophy and accept them rather than rejecting everything. The next is the Jewish calendar. This was actually officially developed in the 4th century AD. And the purpose of the calendar was to time festivals. So, for example, the Hebrews had a solar lunar calendar. So they'd follow the lunar cycle, but then periodically add a 13th month to keep the lunar cycle in line with the solar seasons. So the seasons always stay roughly in the same time period. And so they wanted to manage when do you add these extra months to make sure certain major festivals did not fall on the Sabbath. So that was the primary reason, is trying to juggle all that. At the same time, it also led them to come up with, to date back to when Adam and Eve were supposed to have lived. And having an absolute date for Adam and Eve would be very important, whether or not it was right to be able to say, to give a definite date. In fact, this calendar is still actually used in use today. And the last one is, another huge factor was eschatology, which may seem kind of strange. Okay, creation is about the beginning, eschatology is about the end. How are those two connected? Actually, this is a huge issue, and I'm going to explore that more in the next lesson. Okay, so lesson 5, conclusion. The development of biblical chronology was primarily driven by apologetic concerns rather than a literal interpretation of Scripture. Such attempts necessitated taking the simplest and most definite interpretation of Scripture rather than the most accurate. Okay, so now we're going to talk about eschatology. Now, obviously, all of us have heard something about eschatology, but most of you probably are not familiar with this model from early Jewish and Christian writers. I call it the creation week pattern for human history, but the more technical term is the sex septa millenary construct, kind of a tongue twister there. but basically, it's a pre-Christian Jewish tradition dating from about the first century BC, or somewhere around then. But it's the notion that human history was to last 6 days, and that's trying to parallel the days of creation. So God created the world and man in 6 days, and then human history would then, following that, be 6 days, but these days would be 1,000-year periods. And the way they got that was that from Psalms 94, which was written by Moses, as was Genesis, and talks about in a day to the Lord is 1,000 years. And so they took that very literally, one day equals 1,000 years. And therefore, human history would last 1,000-year days, or 6,000 years. So now what's interesting is for the pre-Christian Jews, they tend to divide this into three 2,000-year blocks. So the first 2,000 years is the time from Adam to Abraham, which is the age of chaos, or the age before the law. And then the next 2,000 years from Abraham to the Messiah is the age of the law. And then finally, you'd have the age of the Messiah from the year 4,000 to the year 6,000. And so based on this model, the Messiah was expected to come exactly 4,000 years after creation. And so this was very important for fueling messianic expectations. And in the first century, this was a huge, huge issue because people had, being oppressed by the Romans, really were looking for Messiah. Now, interesting, Christians had a different spin on this. So they saw human history as 1,000-year periods, but they put Jesus' return and setting up a millennial kingdom as the seventh 1,000 years. So from Adam to the return of Christ would be 6,000 years. So the 6,000 year is the time when Christ, the Messiah, would return, not as opposed to Jews talking about predicting when he would come in the first place. So again, this had huge eschatological implications, trying to date when Christ would come back. Now, this framework implies the ability to predict the end times if, that's the key word, if one can accurately date back to creation. And that requires, one is the creation days be very brief, solar days, or it could be instantaneous, that the Genesis genealogies are complete, with no gaps, so you can simply add up those numbers to get the time span, and also taking the simplest interpretation to avoid any chronological ambiguity. All right, so it's interesting because there's three different models using the same idea, the same creation week pattern for human history. One is the early Jews followed the Hebrew values. So I mentioned earlier that the ages in Genesis 5 and 11 in the Hebrew are not the same as in the Septuagint, and this is where this comes into play. The Jews following the Hebrew values dated creation to roughly around 4,000 to 3,700 BC, and hence, if they expected the Messiah to come in the 4,000 year, that would put the Messiah between the first century and maybe as late as the fourth century, and so that had huge messianic implications, in the first century, because that's saying the Messiah is going to be coming very soon. That would be very powerful to them. Now, the early church were following Septuagint, and using those dates, they put creation around 5,600 to 5,200 BC. And so, but then if you expect the return of Christ in the year 6,000, that would put Christ's return in roughly the 4th century to the 8th century, which would be just a few hundred years ahead of the authors. And one thing that's interesting is this shift in dates between 5,600 and 5,200, this moved to so the earliest ones took the earlier date and they shifted it backward around the 3rd or 4th century. And again, by doing that, they shifted back the estimated return of Christ, but to keep it just beyond the horizon. And then the Latin Vulgate, interesting, Jerome went back to the original Hebrew, restoring the Hebrew values, and so he put creation back to around 4,000 BC, which then put the return of Christ back push that back to the year roughly 2000, our own times. So you have three completely different models based on that same framework, each manipulating that and manipulating the interpretation of scripture to fit what they needed to always have the Messiah or Christ's return to be within a few hundred years of their time. This framework, again, was very flexible. Details could be adjusted so that, again, the Messiah or Christ's return would always be just on the horizon. And the chronological estimates in the early church, when they shifted time backward to keep pushing that time out, keep it just above the horizon. And so when Jerome reintroduced the Hebrew value, that pushed Christ's return to around 2000 AD, around our time. And so that model tended to drop out of favor, not nearly as talked about because, Christ's return was so far in the future, but it got a revival. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with Ussher and Lightfoot. So John Lightfoot in 1642 dated creation to September 17th, 3928 BC. But then James Ussher came along and 8 years later, and he revised it to October 13th, 404 BC. Lightfoot updated his to match, but slightly differently, October 18th, 4004 BC. Now, what's significant about that? I mean, so first of all, they're trying to make an estimate, making certain scriptural assumptions, but the one thing that's interesting is why 4004 BC? That seems so, and why not the earlier date? Well, it turns out if Christ was born roughly 4 BC, as is traditionally assumed, picking 4004 BC would place exactly 4,000 years between Adam and the birth of Christ, which would fit into that Jewish model of the Messiah coming on the 4,000th year. Now, I can't prove that. They didn't, Ussher does not spell that out, but I think there's an obvious implication that this, can shift the date just a little bit to fit that model, having the Messiah come in the 4,000th year, in which his return coming on the 6,000th year. So again, according to Ussher's chronology, Christ's return would be somewhere around 2000 AD. Okay, so what are the implications of this? One is, according to the creation weight pattern for human history, any interpretation of Genesis with an age over 6,000 years would essentially be equated to denying Christ's return. And so, I think this is critically important because this human tradition, again, this creation week pattern does not come from scripture, although it does use scripture. This is purely human construction, that this human tradition effectively constrained interpretation, suppressing the appearance of day-age interpretation or recognition of gaps in genealogy until much later in history. So even though we don't talk about this eschatological idea much today, it had a huge influence on the early church. And, when young creationists say, why didn't the day-age interpretation show up in the early church? Well, it must be a later invention. Well, I think there's a good reason why it didn't show up in the early church. And this is, I think, a major reason for that. Kind of as my concluding lesson, let's talk about creedal statements. So far we've been talking about interpretations, how individual people and groups interpreted the early church chapters of Genesis. But what about creedal statements, doctrinal statements, confessions of faith? What do they say? That's important because they represent authoritative pronouncements for very large segments of the church for very significant time periods. So beginning in the early church, they had creedal statements. The five most important, which are, of course, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and the Council of Orange. These are called ecumenical creeds because they're widely accepted through different denominations and over time, and so are very authoritative and therefore important that we look at them. And then the confessions of faith, these are primarily coming out of the Protestant Reformation, very lengthy declarations of core beliefs. So what, since the issues they're willing to die over, they consider very important. So we have a whole series of different confessions of faith representing different countries and different time periods. Of course, the 95 Theses from Martin Luther, the Augsburg Confession, the Genevan Confession, the French Confession, the Scottish Convention, the Belgic, the Heidelberg Second Helvetic, the 99 Articles of England, and lastly, the Irish Articles and the Westminster Confession of Faith. This last one is perhaps one of the most important confessions of faith for modern believers. These all, again, represent major Protestant groups across all parts of Europe within a large time frame. So the question is, if you actually read through all these, and it only takes maybe an hour or two if you want to do that for yourself, what does it lay out as being essential with regard to issues of creation? So only three things stand out. One is creation ex nihilo. Historically, that has been the one issue related to creation that's always considered an issue of orthodoxy. It's a line in the sand that we have to defend, and that the church has near universal agreement on. And so we obviously do see that supported in these statements. A second one, which we only find clearly stated in the Confessions of Faith coming in the Reformation, is the notion of dual revelation, that also known as the two books theory. So found in the Belgic Confession and also in the French Confession. So we read in the Belgic Confession, we know him, that is God, by two means. First, by creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is before our eyes as the most elegant book. Secondly, he makes himself more clearly and fully known to us by his holy and divine word. So God has revealed himself through scripture. Obviously, that's his very specific revelation, but he's also revealed himself in nature. That's a general revelation. Again, there's a huge point for reason to believe in really embracing this, and trying to show how science and faith work together. But again, this is not just some individual interpretation. This was something that at least many of the reformers believed to be an issue of orthodoxy. There's only one other statement relating to creation that needs to be discussed. That's the phrase that God created in the space of 6 days, and is found in two confessions, the Irish Articles and the Westminster Confession of Faith, and both were influenced by John Usher, the same Usher of the Usher Lightfoot chronology. So question is, what does this tell us about the days of creation? Because actually something that's been pointed out by young earth creationists. So in looking at that phrase, in the space of 6 days, it turns out that statement can be traced back to John Calvin, although other people have later made similar statements. But the addition of "in the space of" was intended to insist the days of creation were real, non-instantaneous periods. Now, the reformers drew a lot from Augustine. They drew so much from him, but in terms of his belief that the days of creation were instantaneous, this is one issue where they said, no, we're going to reject that. That we're going to say that we reject instantaneous creation. It must be periods of time. But the question is, did they specify the periods of time? The answer is no. That the phrase 6 days leave that completely open. And so, for example, they did not, if they wanted to be specific that these were 24-hour periods, they could have simply said 6 natural days or 6 calendar days. But instead, they left that out. And so intentionally leaving the days of creation open without specifying them as being 24-hour periods or anything. And I think that's very important that they did not take that extra step in defining the days of creation. So nowhere in the creeds and confessions of faith do they require days of creation to be 24-hour periods. So kind of as our conclusion, for creation-related issues, only creation ex nihilo and dual revelation were considered essential to Christian faith. The other areas, the age of the earth, the extent of Noah's flood, have always been secondary issues. So we should settle them through peaceful dialogue. So anyway, that's the summary. So anyway, that's the end of my lesson. So I will open it up to questions.
Okay, please, you are open to a question now, and you can also put in the chat.
Right.
I I want to first one, and this is referring to what Hugh Ross always said. The if you look at Genesis chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2, let me see. Yes. So first chapter 1, it always frame it as at the end of each day creation, there was an evening and there was morning, like what you said.
Right.
However, on chapter 2, when it comes to day 7, then it doesn't say that.
Mhm.
And it's a day of rest.
Mhm.
So Hugh Ross is trying to interpret that as saying the evening, there was evening and there was morning is a type of framing a period of time.
Mhm.
And it's not a 24-hour, because if it were day, if it were 24-hour meaning of a day, then it will have the same framing in day 7. But instead, there's day 7, there's no framing of this is there was evening, there was morning.
In,
And in fact, in other passages in the New Testament, they say we are still in a rest. Jesus is our rest, and
Mhm.
he's our 7th day. He's our Sabbath day
Mhm.
rest. So it seems like the day in the case of 7th day is still going on now.
Mhm.
That is, as far as I remember, Hugh Ross' interpretation. What, any comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. That the seventh day is not closed out, hence we are still in the seventh day. But I think, in terms of my lesson, it's important that that's not new. Ross didn't invent that, by himself. That actually goes back to even the early church, the reformers, that the notion that the days of creation are that we're still in the seventh day, and that the seventh day therefore is not a 24-hour period. Now, those that did hold to a calendar interpretation did find ways to wiggle around that, but I think we would agree that it's actually a good argument that the days of creation cannot be simple 24-hour periods. And again, this is not a new interpretation. This is one that goes all the way back to the early church.
in, in the Hebrew, when they say morning and evening,
Mhm.
could that be interpreted as the beginning and the end and the end? Is it used anywhere else in the Bible? The Hebrew words to not mean morning and evening, but to be beginning and end?
Hey,
Uh,
Chuck, correction, in the Genesis, it say there was evening and there was morning. Evening was always first.
Oh, okay.
yeah, that's
So that would be hard to just say end and then beginning. It would need to be beginning, and you couldn't start with an ending.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's different ways to interpret that. I mean, my understanding and may not be correct is that so you have God working during the day, the way, and there's an intentional parallel between God's work here and the human work day. And so God's working during the day, and it says, and evening came, and then, the next morning. So it's closing out the first day, and then the night passes without anything happening and setting up the next day. And so it's interesting for humans, that night period is when we rest rest in the sense of sleeping, but that does not happen here. Time simply passes. So that's how I tend to interpret it. So the evening is simply the end of the previous day, and then the reference to morning is simply at time is advanced to the beginning of the next morning. Now, not everyone is going to agree with me. Many people think of that as simply a summary, both evening and morning, of what happened before, and hence from the Jewish perspective, day starts in the evening rather than the morning. But again, there's some differences of interpretation there. But yeah, I do tend to understand morning and evening there as evening as the ending of the day, morning as the beginning of the day. Because evening and morning are much broader, in Hebrew than in English. But at the same time, there is an intent to parallel God's creation week with human creation week. So I think why they used evening, morning, and day, because there is that intentional parallel going on. It's not exact. God's days are not our days, but at the same time, there is a parallel there. In terms of the references to evening and morning throughout Scripture. I'd have to look that up. I've seen analysis of that, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. Yeah, Ray?
Yeah, based on all your study and knowing the issues of translation. Oh, by the way, thank you for immense amount of scholarship and your sharing it with us. It was wonderful. But in terms of all these different interpretations of things, do you end up coming up with a preferred translation of the Bible in English, or what?
A preferred translation of the Bible. I don't necessarily have a preferred translation. I mean, I tend to leave that to other people. I mean, in terms of Genesis, any, I mean, there's a lot of good translations, like Young's literal translation is probably, if you're trying to get to the nubs, but again, all the translations have their own benefits. Yeah, in terms of Genesis 1 in particular, Rodney Whitefield's book, Reading Genesis 1 is a really good, useful tool. But yeah, in terms of Scripture generally, I don't really have a specific recommendation on translations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. It's such a very well prepared presentation, and I commend you for spending so much time in reading all these literatures and teach us. I have a question. What do you think the modern churches today, especially in America, which majority of them tend to be young earth creationist, where do they get this influence from? Is that because some of the most prominent seminary are leaning toward that way? Is there any reason why it seems like the young earth creationists begin to get popular in the late 1800s, and prior to that, it's not as popular, or it's not as emphasized? What do you think about that, and what is your research show?
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of summarized in the talk, young earth creationism has never been the consensus view of the church. It's kind of waxed and waned. The Reformation period was particularly strong for young earth creationism, but then it kind of waned again. But when we talk about young earth creationism in the church today, we're really talking about modern young earth creationism, not the stuff I've been talking about. And that really starts in like 1950 with Henry Morris, and perhaps earlier to like the 1920s and 30s. But what we think of modern young earth creationism is not the same as what happened in the early church. There's really a new invention, actually much later in history than they age, and it's largely a reaction again to advent of science. With this concept of people compromising, by having a purely theological interpretation and kind of just avoiding the science helps, simplify some things. But that's, so, I think that's one of the biggest eye openers is that, young earth creation today is not the same as in the early church. It really is a very new thing starting, in the 20th century.
John, this is Herb. If we put on, I don't want to go back to 24-hour days things again, because if we put on our simple logical head, if the Earth was there on the first day, but it didn't go into the orbit with the sun until day 4, and we only can define 24-hour days by the orbits of suns and Earth. So which means it's ridiculous to talk about 24-hour days at least for 3 days, right? You can't even define that in the first 3 days. So, the 24-hour day is definitely not correct, because God will not confuse people by, if he wants to really define it, he would say, well, the first 3 days is this and the 4th day is that, but he didn't. He used one interpretation and one language. So I'm sure the day of 24 hours interpretation is not correct.
Yeah, I mean, the two different issues here. One is, did the sun, moon, and stars, were they actually created on the 4th creation day as was understood in the past and even sometimes today, and what implications did it have? So, first of all, my interpretation of Genesis 1 is the sun, moon, and stars were created in the beginning. they only appear in the fourth day. So they were around the first 3 days. So, I don't use that as an argument against younger creationism because, I do believe the sun, moon, and stars were created earlier. But in terms of how the early church fathers understood that, this again was a big, division. There's very clear confusion over this issue because, if the sun, moon, and stars were, not created until the fourth day, what were the first 3 days? And so again, you have very different interpretations. Some defending a calendar day interpretation and saying, well, they're still 24-hour periods. They had 2 models. One is called the wax and wane theory, where God sends out light and brings it back in a 24-hour cycle, and a diurnal model where you have a light source, not the sun, moving around the earth, mimicking the sun. But there were others that said, okay, well, if the sun, moon, and stars are not there, they can't be 24-hour periods. They can't be simple solar days. So that's certainly was an issue in the early church. So some arguing for instantaneous creation, others arguing for creation not in time. That is, the time clock given by the sun did not start till the fourth day. So what were the days before? So so there was definitely a major issue, and I think for us it's easy to say that really kind of rules out younger creationism, but actually not everyone in the early church was convinced of that. Some still held to a calendar day view.
Rodney has a question.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, since we're talking about the fourth day,
Mhm.
John's presentation tonight was absolutely perfect.
Mhm.
It gave us a background that you generally cannot get. And so I think this is a very valuable thing he has done. But since the question of the fourth day came up, and John has also said that you have to have context. John, would you be offended if I touted a new video I have posted?
I would love for you to do that.
Okay, it's a new video on Vimeo. And Hugh Ross has seen an early one of it. This is a better one. And I gave this talk to RTB in San Jose before the lockdown. And I had given it to my church, to a group of more than 100 people. And what the title of it is, Genesis 1, verses 1 through 18, contextualized as a Hebrew of the Exodus.
Mhm.
And what I would like to do is, who should I send you the link? It's a fairly long link,
Mhm.
and you can click on the link and you can watch it. And I would give you guys permission to record it for yourself.
Okay.
I haven't allowed you to download it because I just had it out now for about since the end of July, something like that. So who should I send the link to?
Rodney, send it to me.
Yeah, send it
David
to
Wu.
send
Yeah.
to David. He can either forward to me or give you my email address. I'm happy if you email me directly too. So whichever.
Okay, so I'll send it to David Wu. And was that your address on the
My address is on the, you
in the
should,
invitation to the meeting?
yes, correct.
Okay, so I'll send both John and David a link to that, and you can look at it. I have just got it up because I was going to an ASA meeting at the end of July.
Could you tell us what your video is?
It talks about Genesis chapter, the first 28 verses of Genesis. And it says that the first 28 verses of Genesis are an argument by Moses in the context of the Exodus, refuting the creation story of the Egyptians at Heliopolis. And I think it's interesting because we have not had this context before. So with your permission, I'll send you the link and you can distribute it then to everybody else too.
Look forward to watching it.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely looking forward to watching that.
Okay.
Carl,
any other comments or questions? Oh,
Carl, go ahead.
Carl,
Carl's raising his hand.
I really thank you for this presentation. It's really excellent. I haven't been able to find this information anywhere else, so that was quite new to me. I appreciate that. Wondering, can you give the just a brief, thumbnail sketch of what the difference is between modern young Earth creationism and the original young Earth creationism?
Right. Well, I mean, young Earth creationism, in the early church, I mean, they did have interpretation, calendar interpretation, the Earth being, roughly 6,000 years old. Modern creationism really started, with Henry Morris, emphasizing things like flood geology, really it's a reaction against science. I mean, that's really what drives modern young Earth creationism. It's rejection against, reaction against, the Earth being old, coming through geology and so forth. But being very dogmatic. I mean, that's one of the biggest differences. In the early church, they had views and they differed, but they weren't as dogmatic about it as it wasn't an existential crisis of the word non-calendar interpretation, but they weren't deemed heretics or anything like that. So I think that's probably one of the biggest differences. Just the modern young Earth creation is much more dogmatic, and very much anti-science, which is not true in early time periods. And also the other point is it doesn't, on one hand, it follows the tradition of the church. It doesn't directly inherit from it. Really, in a sense, creates its own version, again, in the 20th century. All right, was there another question?
I have a couple questions, kind of related to that. I think you said Augustine and some of the early church fathers didn't hold to a 24-hour day.
Right.
And that was based on exegesis, is that correct?
Right. I mean, there's several reasons, but actually, some of it was definitely related to exegesis.
Okay, so when we have Jesus talking about, working 6 days and then resting, like the model, right, for us, how would they have understood that? Because that seems to be on face value anyway, based on a 24-hour.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing, for us, and people reading through a either Greco-Roman perspective in the early church or today, we tend to read in terms of a modern scientific cosmology, but this was a Jewish cosmology. And the way we know that is the very conclusion, which is, what tells you what the author is trying to communicate, is the Sabbath pattern. And that pattern is work 6, rest 1, or rest on the 7th. It's not about the days. I mean, if you look throughout scripture and look at the Sabbath, it's not about 6 days and 1 day, or rest on the 7th day. For example, land Sabbath is work 6 years, rest 1. Or you can have a Sabbath, so you work 7 7-year periods, and then you have an extra year of rest. So it was the pattern of 6th and 7th that mattered, not day. And I think, and that my whole point about, the 6th day, or day is indefinite. I mean, that's, what it's really emphasizing is, the 6th and 7th are put in the definite. That is the emphasis here, because that's the Sabbath pattern, and de-emphasizing day. So even back then, there's some understanding that, that is not about, again, day, which is what we focus on, but it's about the pattern, work 6, rest 1, independently of the time period for that.
Thank you.
All right, another question?
well, I give another minute or two. I really enjoy John Millen come to present us a tremendous amount of preparation and really well thought out presentation. Really, thank you. Just a few announcements. I wish everybody have a very happy and good Thanksgiving coming week, and with your family. Think of a thing that we can thank God for in our life. Next month, we're going to take another month of rest, not going to have anything. And starting January, first month, we'll have Dr. Mancha, Bob Mancha, come to present to us about epigenetics. But he would do that in February. Month of January is more like a review of basic biology for a lot of people who don't major in biology. So he will go through that in January. Do we have any other questions? Or comments?
Yes, yes, hello.
Yes.
Yes, hi, this is Marina. Yes, thank you. David. The speech was excellent. We really appreciate it. Yes, definitely give us a lot of
Marina,
hope.
you have an internet reception problem. I can hear it clearly. Can you
Okay,
repeat
yes,
that?
sorry. Yes, I was just saying thank you, David, and thank you, John, for the great presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, I had two quick questions. One about for the fourth day, about how we can interpret it as the sun, moon, and stars appearing
Mhm.
on that day. What is exactly the like the Hebrew maybe evidence that we have for that interpretation?
Yeah, there's actually several points. Rodney Whitefield is probably the best one for that, but let me just kind of make one quick point. Um, you know, if you look at verse 14 and 15, it talks about um, uh, the light appearing. The verb haya is not to create, which is asa bara or to make, but is haya. And then you have two verses talking about God making it, and then the closing verse. And the problem is people tend to flip that around and emphasize God creating. So, but the first two verses really emphasize, the appearance of light, God's bringing light to the earth, and the sun and the moon. And then it has two verses telling you, by the way, I'm the one that made that. So the making there is in the past tense, but the action of appearing is what happens right then. But again, Rodney Whitefield, if you really want to dig in details, Rodney Whitefield has a nice short article on that.
Oh, okay, yes, that's great. So you said that the making part, that's in the past tense.
Right. Yeah. I mentioned that the Hebrew verbs do not have verb tense. So
Yeah.
you have completed or incomplete. And so it's completed, but it doesn't tell you when it was completed. So it could be made or had made. That distinction is in English, but not in Hebrew. And so it's often translated made, but we could just as easily translate it had made, meaning that it's something God did, but he did it at some point previous to that. So again, that's important to understand, in the Hebrew, it's not as precise as the English. So in English, we tend to read it as it happened then, because that's how our English translations go. But the Hebrew does not require that.
Okay, I see. And the light appearing, you said that was in Genesis 1:14, you were saying.
Yeah. So the
That
first two verses talk about the light appearing. That's what God did. And then the next two statements about it being made are God saying, I'm responsible for that. But it's not saying it happened. God creating it happened right then. It's simply saying, by the way, I'm the one that did that. Essentially, even though that event didn't happen right then, but the emphasis is on God saying, I'm the one that made that. So they appeared. That's the first two verses. and then God taking credit for it, the second two verses. And, you know, again, we tend to invert those and read those last two verses first, and, you know, treat it as God's creating. It's like, no, 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 that's not what it says. You know, and again, that first verse is the verb is haya, which is simply to appear, you know, or come to be. Very generic word, is not the word to make. The make appears in that second pair of verses where God is simply, you know, saying, I did make it, but I made it in the past, essentially.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's very detailed. That's great. Thank you, John. And I just wanted to ask you that what the last point on your, I think it was on your second to last slide when you had lesson 7 conclusion.
Mhm.
Yes, what I think you named 3 specific things there, events. One of them was Noah's flood, and 2 other things. I didn't catch that last point. What was your point in, or what were those 3 events that you named, and your point in that last statement that you had on that slide?
The 3 points in terms of the summary from the creedal statements, what they included, is that the one you're asking about?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So the 3 things relating to creation that are included in the creedal statements and the confessions of faith. One, and most importantly, is creation ex nihilo. That was uniformly believed throughout church history and even earlier Jewish sources. That was, you know, a statement of orthodoxy. You know, we really have to believe this. The second was dual revelation, that God reveals himself through scripture, but God also reveals himself through nature. You know, scripture is God's special revelation, nature is God's general revelation. And both of those, you know, in a sense, are connected. So there's 2 confessions of faith that specifically state that. And the third statement was this curious phrase, in the space of 6 days, which appears in 2 of the statements, the Irish Articles and the Westminster Confession of Faith. And then I just focus on what does that really mean. It's not about defining the days as calendar days, but simply saying the days are non-instantaneous. So it's not, you know, requiring young earth creationism, is simply ruling out instantaneous creation.
Okay, yes. And then for your conclusion for that lesson 7, you said something about Noah's flood, that last point.
Yeah. So the things I mentioned are the things that, you know, the church leaders felt were critical doctrine, and the things, what I was listing there was things that are not critical doctrine. They're not found in those doctrinal statements. You know, the age of the earth, the extent of Noah's flood, and the days of creation, their length, are not issues described in the confessions of faith, the creeds, and so forth. Those are issues of interpretation, hence issues that we can debate, we can disagree on. They're not things that we have to draw a line on. You know, and that's kind of, you know, the younger creationists tend to put those particular issues as issues of orthodoxy, where we'll divide the church over, and that's not true. Church has never viewed them that way.
I see. Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much again, John, for answering my questions and for the wonderful presentation. We appreciate it.
And I will send a copy of the PowerPoint and some other resources to David to give out to all of you, because, you know, there's a lot of things obviously I had to go very fast. There's so many more details, and so there's more information out there for anyone interested in that.
Okay,
Great. Yes,
thank you.
and thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
So Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick comment, I guess. I'm curious to know if you would agree, but I had the impression that a large part of this more modern debate about the age of the earth was kind of kicked off by a book that was published probably in the late 60s by Whitcomb and Morris, The Genesis Flood. And it was kind of the Genesis Flood, that book, that really kind of kicked all of, would you agree with that, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, Whitcomb and Morris were 2 other major earlier. In fact, I mean, I'd have to go back and review exactly who did what when, but Henry Morris was one major figure. Whitcomb and Morris, Genesis Flood, was definitely another major issue, or another major proponent of modern young earth creationism. They had some influences before that. But I mean, the last major, definition of a faith called the Fundamentals, written in 1905, 1915. Important to understand, even that late, they did not include the days of creation or the extent of Noah's flood as issues of as a doctrinal essential. And so after that time, that's when modern young earth creationism starts up and saying, hey, we need to elevate this to the issue of a fundamental, which the church had not accepted. And so, yeah, so Morris, Whitcomb, were two of the major drivers in terms of developing what we think of as young earth creationism today.
The other question I had was regarding John Sailhammer. He has the view, it seems, that you should read Genesis as being basically restricted to just the land of Israel. The word Aretz is used, right? So that is a word that often can be used as meaning the land, meaning basically the land of Israel or the surrounding area. Just wondered if you had any quick thoughts about whether you think John Sailhammer's ideas have legs or not.
Yeah, I mean, I did use his work in my research. I mean, just kind of as a additional perspective, he has some really interesting information on the early church, but I don't necessarily agree with his interpretation. So I tend to, my interpretation be more closer to the reason to believe you. Why Scripture is always talking locally. I mean, the terminology is always local. I think in Genesis 1, we're forced to interpret it as global. So even though the words are local, the implication is global, whereas in other places that's not true. So in that case, I would disagree with John Sailhammer.
Thank you.
Carl?
Yes, just wondering, would you're actually a scientist, actually, to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Would you say that the modern young earth creation view has a leg to stand on scientifically or not?
No. Yeah, I mean, it's all, based on biblical interpretation, taking it in a wooden literal sense, and not understanding the original Hebrew. I mean, so, the science is all rubbish. I mean, there's an article, something written by someone named Douglas Del Tondo, who published it for Reason to Believe. And I say published, it just developed it. It goes through some of the young earth arguments. I mean, several dozen, and just rips them to shreds. And I've encountered hundreds, and all of them are just absolute complete nonsense. Yeah, again, they're not trying to be scientific. They're trying to follow tradition, and and then once they decide what they want to believe, fit the science to it.
Well, of course, God could have done it any way he wanted, and he could make it look any way he wants.
Sure.
Can we say it isn't 6,000 years old and he didn't make it look old? I don't think we can disprove that.
Right.
But what would be the purpose? So
Right.
for it to be 6,000 years old, he had to make old light coming to us from the universe as the astronomers look at it, and he would have had to pull lots of tricks. And I see no justification to believe, and for the young earthers, they are now saying that, well, the physics changed in time, and if the laws of gravity changed, if the speed of light changed, then if we don't have a basis on how to do our science, then I just don't. To me, it's not as glorious a world as if that he actually did create for us to love and understand.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, one thing, in that, near the final slide, one thing that in their confessions of faith from the Reformation, they did include is the notion of dual revelation, that God revealed himself in nature and through Scripture. I think that's absolutely critical for us to emphasize that is something that the church has said, hey, this is critically important. This is how we can know about things like the age of the earth, things that Scripture is not very specific on, and that's important, whereas young earth creationists will deny that, generally downplay it, and try to put things like the age of creation, the extent of the flood as the essential instead. And so that's not, but by going to those, creedal statements, those confessions of faith, I think that's a huge argument for our side, that dual revelation is considered, is not something new, it's not something we came up just to fit science, but that's something that came up in the Reformation, and that is a major tool to argue against young earth creationism.
By the way, for those who you don't know, Chuck is a astronomy professor. So whatever he said has a lot of weight. Okay.
Yeah. Well, one argument I haven't heard much of, but I really like a lot, is the fact if there's two interpretations of the Bible, and one reflects a glorious, fantastic God, and the other reflects a pull it out of the hat magician.
Mhm.
Which should you prefer? You'd prefer the one that reflects a glorious, magnificent God that out of four fundamental forces and a few other things has this universe that evolves billions of years without any intervention. Then he intervenes, and creates some more, and then it goes a long time. And I mean, to create autopilot things that can go a billion years on autopilot, that is magnificent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good argument. It's also an argument, kind of an issue of perspective. 'Cause I mean, young, in a sense, would make the same argument in the reverse direction. In their perspective, God just does it, just commands it, as opposed to this long process, things just happen. So, I mean, I do like your argument, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily very persuasive.
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, well.
Once we get into heaven and we see eternity, this process may have been a blink of an eye.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, with that comment, I think we come to the conclusion of our time. Can I ask Ray to give us a prayer as we leave? Thank you.
Oh, dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for